Hi everybody. This week's mini lecture is on organizational change and stress management. There are many forces for change that put pressure on individuals and organizations. Here are some categories and some examples for you. The workforce. Think about demographics that we talked about earlier on in the block. The demographics of the workforce have been changing for quite some time, and this will force organizations to make changes as well to adapt to that. Technology is changing as well. An example is the use of social media for businesses. Economic shocks such as recession and the shift from a manufacturing to a service-oriented economy can create situations where organizations need to make sometimes dramatic changes. Competition is an ever-present force for change in organizations, and in fact, what companies compete on can also change. Social trends and world politics, such as the unrest in the Middle East, can also force organizations to make changes. Sources of resistance to change can be individual sources or organizational sources. Here are some examples of individual sources of resistance to change and organizational sources of resistance to change. I would encourage you to think about the contingency approach when you think about resistance to change. That is, an individual's habits combined with organizational structural inertia will make resistance to change even greater. There are many ways to overcome resistance to change. Organizations can conduct education and communication sessions, oftentimes explaining why an organization is changing. What they're changing can go a long way toward overcoming resistance to change with employees. Better yet, get employees' participation in the change. This will increase buy-in from employees around what needs to happen for the organization as it goes through change. Building support and commitment is something that needs to be done at the leadership level, but at the employee level as well. Positive relationships need to be built, preferably ahead of time, ahead of change, so that employees within an organization understand that management is supporting them and understand that the organization is supporting them. Fair implementation, particularly transparency, again back to the education and communication point, fair implementation of change is critical in an organization, including transparency. As much as possible, focus on organizational justice concepts like distributive justice, procedural justice, and interactional justice. Manipulation and co-optation are techniques that should be avoided if at all possible. Organizations can select for acceptance of change, meaning as individuals go through the hiring process, particularly screening and interviewing, they can be selected for acceptance of change. There are ways to judge whether or not somebody will be accepting of change from a psychological standpoint as well as from a behavioral standpoint, and either or both of these can be explored during the hiring process. Lastly, we have coercion. This involves direct threats and again is generally not considered an effective way to overcome resistance to change. However, there may be times, maybe instances where safety or time pressures force an organization's leaders to overcome resistance to change through coercion. One of the most effective frameworks for managing change that I've seen in organizations in practice is John Kotter's 8-step process for managing change. This is something I've had personal experience with, and if possible, following these 8 steps will help an organization to effectively move through the change process. The first step is to establish a sense of urgency and create a compelling reason for the change. The sense of urgency needs to be propagated throughout the entire organization, from the top to the bottom. The second step is to form a coalition with the power to lead the change. That coalition may or may not be comprised of the organization's top leaders, but the key terms here are coalition, meaning a group of people, and the power to lead the change. And so when selecting a coalition to help drive this, it's key to understand who can help lead the change. That might not necessarily be somebody who's in a formal leadership position, but it might be somebody that has a lot of referent power or a lot of tenure within the organization. The third step is to create a new vision to direct the change. This should be done by top management. If participation is possible by individuals at lower levels within the organization, or if the organization is small, adding that component in, having people at lower levels within the organization help to create that vision, is a form of participation and will help overcome resistance to change. Once that vision is created, it needs to be communicated throughout the entire organization. Next, empower others by removing barriers to change. This is a very important function of management in general, but in times of change in organizations, leaders need to be particularly paying attention to the barriers to change. This will help overcome resistance during the change process. Next, plan for, create, and reward short-term wins. Step 6 is really important, but it's often forgotten by organizations. Many organizations will come up with a change. They'll follow maybe even some of these steps, but they don't do anything to mark progress until after everything is over. This can be problematic in helping motivate employees to move through a change process, particularly if that change process takes a long period of time. So to the extent possible, program in milestones throughout the process and take the time to stop when those milestones are met and engage with employees at that time. The next step is consolidating improvements, reassessing, and adjusting. It's possible that you may need to move back to an earlier step in the process at this point in time, depending on the assessment that you make. Lastly, it's important to reinforce success. You need to show the relationship between new behaviors adopted by employees in the organization and the organization's success. Much like step number 6, step number 8 is often overlooked in organizations. Many organizations will plow through changes and not stop at the end to reinforce success. If you do this, those new behaviors are more likely to be adopted by employees and to be sustained over time. The next topic in this mini lecture is work stress. Work stress is a response to something that is perceived to be both uncertain and important. Uncertainty is key here. Uncertainty creates psychological stress in individuals. We typically break up work stress into two kinds of categories: challenge stressors and hindrance stressors. Challenge stressors are typically associated with the workload, time pressures to complete tasks, and urgency in general. The thing about challenge stressors is that they tend to motivate people. Not that this is necessarily a positive form of stress, but that the stressors are strong enough to motivate people into action, but not strong enough to motivate people to withdraw. On the other hand, hindrance stressors do tend to motivate people to withdraw. These are stressors that keep you from reaching your goals. Unrealistic goals in and of themselves can be a hindrance stressor. Stress can come from a number of different sources within or external to the organization. There can be environmental factors. One example might be a general recession in the economy. Organizational factors that may be related to that might be layoffs or furloughs. And then personal factors, again, that may be related to that are a tight financial situation for a family. And so the recession may be associated with furloughs, which may in fact put personal stress on a family because of lack of funds. And so it's important to remember that stressors are additive and they're cumulative. The more stressors that an individual experiences, the greater the effect that those stressors will have on the individual. They're also cumulative over time. So the more stressors that are not dealt with over time can also have a significant impact on individuals. There are many physiological, psychological, and behavioral consequences of experiences of stress in the workplace. The traditional notion that stress is related to heart attacks has been demonstrated in research, but we now know that there are a huge variety of physiological symptoms that people experience when they are under periods of extreme stress. Physiological symptoms include physical symptoms that are a manifestation of psychological stress. And so heart attacks, as I mentioned before, is kind of a straightforward example. Compromised immune systems. People can lose weight, they can eat more, they can sleep more poorly, or they can actually sleep a greater number of hours. These are just some examples of physiological consequences of stress. Psychological consequences of stress include job dissatisfaction and other withdrawal cognitions. Lastly, there are behavioral symptoms of stress. Probably the most prominent ones seen in the workplace are withdrawal behaviors. Absences, turnover, decreases in productivity are things that are pretty clear signs that an individual is experiencing stress. In terms of managing stress, from an organizational behavior standpoint, we look at individual approaches and we look at organizational approaches. Individual approaches can include time management techniques, physical exercise, relaxation, and an expanded social support network. Many of you included examples of these in the first written assignment that you completed for class. Organizations can also take steps to manage stress for their employees. Training, realistic goal setting, redesign of jobs, increased employee involvement, improved organizational communication, sabbaticals, and corporate wellness programs are some common examples of organizational approaches to managing stress.